Oh, looks like the guy's driving his chainsaw by again. It'd be a lot cooler if it was a real dirt bike. Okay, one of the first things you want to do when you're gluing up a body blank is look at your boards and see if you have imperfections anywhere on your boards. In this case, on this board, I'm looking right along the edges particularly. Of course, I want to know in the middle too. This is a nice clear piece of basswood, so I'm in good shape as far as this board goes. The second board, looking on the first side, looking along the edges. This looks good here. I flip it over. I'm looking. Okay, here's a spot. Here's a problem spot right there. Okay, why am I doing this? Okay, I need to make sure that I have decided which two edges I'm going to join. On the first board, either edge works. On this board, I don't want this in the middle of the guitar body, so I will be joining this edge. This is obviously a rough edge, so I'm going to have to be planing this down. One other thing that I want to point out is the grain. Let's take a look at the grain here. You see how the grain angles slightly this way. This is going to be important when we start planing. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit more about grain runout here. As you can see, I have a very long jointer plane here. Many people don't have that. You don't really need that to do joinery. It can be helpful, it can be handy. It can also introduce a little bit higher learning curve because you have to learn how to use the plane. Like with any other tool, you need to know how to use the tool. You don't necessarily need to use a plane to do jointery. The plane just simplifies a couple of things as far as squaring things up. But one thing I do want to note, the reason I was pointing out the grain runout earlier. Okay, right now I have the grain moving slightly this way. As you know, grain doesn't move perfectly parallel on the board here. So in this case, it goes this way. Therefore, I want to plane this way. I want to run the plane this way so that I'm cutting off the grain. I'm cutting off the grains like this. If I were to go this way, the blade will tend to come in here and split things out. That's why we plane across the grain runout that way. Anytime you're doing anything that involves scraping, planing, that sort of thing, it's good to pay attention to the grain runout. I guess with that, I'll start doing some quick rough planing just to smooth out the actual edge. All right, now if we look here, I'm just going to pull this camera up here. Now instead of the rough edge, we now have a much smoother, cleaner edge. I'm not going to keep planing because, as you can see, I'm removing material. I want to make sure everything is square, both directions, and straight along this edge. And it may wind up being that the plane becomes a little bit too much of a blunt instrument, and I may need to use a little bit finer tools to true this up exactly the way I want it. Okay, I'm going to show you how I mark the high spots here. I have a flashlight, my machinist square. I've already marked them, but just to show you how I go about it. So I have it all squared up on the long side of the board here. I come along here, you see how the light is bleeding out from behind the square. As I move it over, you can see the bleed changes, the color changes actually. So it's a little harder to pick up on the camera, but you can see right there, it doesn't bleed as brightly. It's more of a golden color. It's because it's being filtered through the actual wood. So what I'm doing here is very similar to what I was doing the other direction. I use this straight edge. It's a little hard to do while holding the camera, but I use this straight edge. I shine the flashlight along the edges and I see where the light peeks out. And I've just been marking it with the pencil. The difference is that I'm actually doing this the amount of wood to be removed is very, very minimal. So I'm just using this blade, a utility knife, to just go through and take off just the least bit of wood. If we take a look here at what the plane has been pulling off, I mean, it's nice thin shaving, but it's more material than I want to remove, because that much material is actually pretty much how much the gap was. So that might be a little too aggressive. So this is just scraping along here like so. Is a far less aggressive way to remove material. Okay, now what we have here is a seam that of course hasn't been joined yet. I take the flashlight across the back side of it and just look for little spots where the light goes through. Obviously there's an obvious seam right there, so just take my pencil, mark that on both boards. A little bit of the light right here. So I want to make sure that I have that marked out. I want to make sure that I have that marked out so that I can go back and just do a little more leveling. So here we sit. We have our boards finished, ready for joinery here. Now, one thing I didn't mention in the previous little installment here is that even if you're using a mechanical joiner, like an electric joiner, once again, that still depends on setup. So I had one, I don't have it anymore, I gave it away. It was very old, and you could get in the ballpark, but it didn't leave you with something finished. So you still need to be doing the measuring and marking, same as if you're using a plane or you're using a razor blade or you're using sandpaper or whatever. You need to make sure that this stuff is square, these are square with each other, and you don't have a bunch of gapping going on. Once you've done that, here I have prepared my super fancy joinery box, also known as the box in which a generator that I bought last winter and never opened sits. I covered it with plastic because wood glue doesn't stick quite so well to plastic as it does to wood. And there's a piece of plywood under here that isn't really something I want to have be part of this guitar, so that's what we're doing here. Now, what I have in my hand, this is good old original Titebond glue. You'll notice I use Titebond original for basically every part of this process. I might get into glues a little bit later. The reason I use it, okay, pluses, it's easy to use, it's cheap, it's plentiful, it's reversible. So if I need to take a joint apart, I can do that. And it has a long open time, working time. Downsides, it's not waterproof. So if it gets wet, it will weaken. It doesn't adhere to itself, for example, like a hot hide glue. So there's upsides and downsides to everything. But for a joint like this that I really don't expect to take apart, you could use really any wood glue. And just one note for those who aren't familiar with joinery or how wood glues work. This is I believe PVA, polyvinyl acetate, acrylic, something. It's made of chemicals that work to glue wood. And the way it basically works is that it gets into the wood fibers. So there's water in this, which is why it's not waterproof. It gets into the wood fibers, causing them to swell, and actually when you clamp it together, those swollen wood fibers interlock. So it's a combination of the glue and an actual mechanical joint. That's why it's so strong. That's why it's stronger than the wood around it. That's also why if you have a lousy joint with poor contact, or if you have your grain not really running parallel to each other, you wind up with weak joints because the glue itself isn't that strong. The joint of a good wood adhesion is the part that's strong. So now before you glue this up, what you want to do is do a dry run, literally a dry run, no glue, clamp it up, get your clamps all set and ready to go. This glue has pretty long open time, so it's not that big of a hurry to get it before it sets. Especially for a joint like this that's really simple with a really simple clamping setup. For more complicated joints like scarf joints on headstocks, things like that, you're definitely going to want to be doing some dry runs, because the complication that glue adds, particularly like Titebond, is that it is slippery. So I'm just going to go buy some new glue because this stuff's shot. Look at that. All right, here's where we were when I found that my glue had gone bad.
It's another thing to know about tight bond. It will go bad over time, or freezing will make it get a little wonky on you. So anyway, here we are. I'm going to apply the glue, show approximately how much I like to do here and how I distribute it, and then we'll clamp this thing up. First thing, get all the things off of your lumber, like the Schwinn user manual here. All right, now I'm just going to go through just a couple of lines here, like so. I take, this is just a little piece of cardboard here. I like to spread, get it to this end here, spread. I don't like to, I'm not totally squeegeeing it. I just want to get good coverage all the way down the board. And we're a little light here on the end, so I'm just going to do this. It is running out a little bit on the back side. We'll worry about that at another point. Not the biggest issue at the moment. So now, and this is the beauty of good old original Tide Bond, is that we have a fairly long open time, which allows me to do a little bit of pre-cleaning here before clamping up. All right, I'm just going to tip this piece down, line it up. Okay, now I have my first clamp here on the end, so I'm just going to square that up and tighten it up a little bit. Make sure that they're both nice and flat on the surface there. And a little bit of pressure. The glue should start squeezing out very nicely. Now I did adjust these so I don't have to do massive adjustments once I'm clamping up. Let's get a little bit of pressure on there. Move on to the next clamp. I'm using 4 clamps for this. Roughly equally spaced. Clamp it up. Last one here. About like that. Okay. Now what we want to make sure, that one board hasn't popped up significantly proud of the other. They are actually very, very, very level. And then the other thing is that there should be enough glue squeeze out so that it's basically kind of like a little row of BBs, I've heard it described as. And so you want a little bit of glue squeeze out. It doesn't need to be a huge amount of glue squeeze out, but you want to have enough so that you can tell that there's glue throughout the entire joint. And then with that, we'll just let this sit here. Usually I just let it sit a day at least before I do anything with it. Really, you can move it around and stuff like that, usually about an hour of dry time. Depending on the type of joint it is too. Once again, this is a pretty simple and pretty wide joint, so that's somewhat easier to deal with then. So anyway, we will leave this. I will seal my glue this time so that it doesn't get weird on me. I will wipe the sweat out of my eye. And we'll pick it up, probably working on the neck next time. Thanks.
Who asked that guy's opinion?